We continue now at the top of Daf 80a Daf and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 80a. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah said that the vlad of a toda, that's the offspring of a carbon toda, or the tamura of a toda, that's the attempted substitute of a carbon toda, or the chiluf of a toda, that's the replacement of a carbon toda. All of those animals need to be offered, but the accompanying bread is not brought with those animals. It's just brought with the original. And on the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a brisa. The brisa elaborated. Let's say you have a situation of chiluf, of replacement. So, for example, the original animal that was designated as the carbon toda, it got lost, and so the individual brought another animal, and then the first animal was found. Now you have two animals in front of you, and so the brisa said whichever one the person wants to bring first, he brings first, and he brings the bread with that animal, and then the second animal is brought as well without the bread. And on the previous Amud, the Gemara quoted from Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan says, this halacha that there's no bread for the vlad or the tmura or the chiluf, that's only true in a situation where the kapara was already achieved, where the atonement was already fulfilled. But if it's a situation where the atonement, the kapara, was not fulfilled, so then the bread does in fact have to be brought. And on the previous Amud, Rav Amram analyzed this and said, what exactly are we talking about? If we're talking about a toda of obligation, well, that already was stated in the brisa. Again, the brisa said that he chooses whatever animal he wants to choose, and whichever one he brings first, meaning to say achieving the atonement, whichever one he brings first fulfills the obligation, that's the one that he brings the bread with. And then the second one, the bread is not brought with that, and so therefore was already stated in the brisa. So what exactly was Rabbi Yochanan saying? And so the Gemara continues now and says, Ella rather, achalife toda nedava. We're talking here about the replacement of a toda that was donated, but bein lefnei kapara, bein la'achar kapara, to unas lechem. But that can't be the case either, because the halacha is when it comes to a toda that's an adava, whether before the kapara, whether after the kapara, actually lechem is in fact required. And the reason for that is marbe betodo, so he's just considered to be increasing the amount of todas that he is bringing, since he was just bringing a donated one in the first place. So if he then brings another one, he's just adding to the amount that he's donating, and so the bread actually would be required. And so the Gemara continues, Ella rather avlad toda. What we're going to say is, maybe Rabbi Yochanan is talking avlad toda nedava. He's talking about a situation of a donated toda, and we're talking about the offspring of that toda. But there, bein lefnei kapara, bein la'achar kapara, ein tunin lechem. Over there, whether before the kapara, whether after the kapara, there actually is no requirement of bread. And the reason for that is moser de todi. That's just considered to be a residual carbon toda, and so that cannot be what Rabbi Yochanan's talking about. And so the Gemara continues, Ella rather, avlad toda chova. We're talking about a situation of a vlad toda, the offspring of a toda, that's a chova, that's an obligation. Lifnei kapara ton lechem. Now before the kapara, so lechem, so bread is required. La'achar kapara ain't ton lechem, but once there's already a kapara, so then the bread is not required. The Gemara continues, my kamashmal, and what is this teaching us? The kasavar Rabbi Yochanan holds adam mischaper b'shvach hektish. The person is able to get a kapara, a person can achieve an atonement through an animal that represents a benefit that accrued to hektish. That's what it means, shvach hektish. Have bonami abaya ki hai gavna. And the Gemara says that Abaya also analyzed Rabbi Yochanan's teaching in this exact same manner and reached the same conclusion as Rav Amram. And Rashi Ksavyan explains, Ela chalife todas nedava. Rather, you'll say we're going on the case of chalife, the replacement of a todas nedava, could go into Amar harezu toda. The example of that would be, instead of saying hare alai toda, case of hare alai is a chova, that's an obligation. If the animal gets lost, you need to bring another animal. But if a person says harezu, this animal is a toda, nothing needs to be replaced if the animal gets lost. Veino chai b'achrayusa, the person is not chayv, he's not liable to provide any guarantee. V'av, then it gets lost. V'hifresh acheres, and now he separates another one, even though he did not need to. So over there, marbe b'todos. So over there, of course, he has to bring the bread all the time. He's just increasing the amount of todos. V'lav chalifani, that's not an exchange. Lo mechayv b'achrayusa, there is no liability to provide a guarantee. To kamai, so he doesn't have to guarantee the first one. Ela toda bi'ape nafshi, essentially, it's its own toda. Utuna lechem afila nischaper borishona, and lechem would be required even if there is a kapara with the first one, and so therefore it wouldn't make any difference even if the kapara already was achieved. Bread would be required, so that cannot be what Rabbi Yochanan is talking about. And so then the Gemara suggested we're talking about vlad toda nedava, the offspring of a donated toda. But the problem with that, again, the Gemara said, was whether before or after kapara, there's no requirement of lechem. And why is there no requirement? Because moser the toda, the Gemara said that it's residual toda, meaning yeseros shegadal al hatoda v'lav toda atzma. It's like extra, so to speak, that grew upon the toda, and it's not really the toda itself. And so Rashi continues, the Gemara then said, Ella avlad todas chova, rather, Rabbi Yochanan was going on the offspring of a toda that was an obligation, and Kama Rabbi Yochanan is saying, Lifnei kapara ton lechem, before the atonement was achieved, so then bread would be required if he brings the vlad. Because Rabbi Yochanan holds, Adam ischaper b'shvach sheishbiach hektish la'achar shehuktish. Let's say you have hektish, that it improves, there's a benefit, so to speak, that accrues after it was already sanctified, like in this case where there's an offspring, a person is allowed to be mischaper with that. He can bring that as an atonement. Hilkach, therefore, kevan deilu of the toda nafik yidei nidvaso bevlad toda, since if the toda would have been lost, he can fulfill the obligation of his nadav. Now remember, over here we're talking about a todas chova, a hare alai situation where he has an obligation. He'd be able to bring the offspring. Karinon beiv utuuna lechem. So in such a situation, that would be a fulfillment of his nadav, and we would say it requires bread im hikriva tchila if he brings it first. Do'ahani lei devahai yotzi yidei nidro, because through this he can fulfill his neder. Avol vlad todas nedava, but let's say you have the offspring of a todas nedava, delo ale ramya imavda, there he has no responsibility if it's lost. There's no responsibility to replace. So lekol meimer avlad b'makam toda, who there we wouldn't say that the offspring is in the place of the toda, uvo mischaper, he's getting a kapara through that. Im ha'im kayemes, because if the mother was still around, min hadin sarich lakriva, he would need to bring it. V'imavda below vlad nami have a miftri, and if it gets lost and there's no offspring, he's completely exempt. And finally, the Gemara said, "Havabu Abaya Nami ki Haygavna de Rav Amram." Abaya analyzed Rabbi Yochanan's statement in the exact same manner as Rav Amram, umeshani lo nami kedeshanyan, and gave the same answer. And we will note over here that essentially the Gemara is applying to Vlad Todas Chova the exact same logic that it applied to a situation of Chiluf, a situation of a replacement of a Toda that was a Chova. It's just that by the Toda that was a Chova with a replacement, it's obvious because the Brisa already stated it. The Brisa said that if the person wants to bring the second animal first, he's achieving the kapara through the second animal, he brings the bread with that second animal that he actually brought first. That the Brisa already said, so it could not have been what Rabbi Yochanan was saying. It's too obvious, essentially. And so therefore the Gemara now is saying Rabbi Yochanan must have been talking about the Vlad, the offspring, which essentially is being treated exactly the same as the Chiluf, and the reason why it's being treated the same is again because Rabbi Yochanan holds a person is able to be mischaper with the Shvach, Shehishbiach Hektish, a person is able to be mischaper with this offspring. And the Gemara continues, Itmar Nami was stated as well, Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Amar Rav Yochanan, Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Chilufei Toda Nadav, if you have the replacement, again, of a donated Toda, Bein Lefnei Kapora, Bein La'achar Kapora Tu'una Lechem, whether before the owner achieves atonement, whether after he achieves atonement, we say that the bread is required. And the reason for that, again, is when we're talking about a Toda that's an Adava, Marbe Betodosu, that's a situation of simply increasing the amount of Todos, as we said. Now, Vlad Toda Nadava, with regards to the offspring of a Toda that's an Adava, Bein Lefnei Kapora, Bein La'achar Kapora, whether it's before the atonement, whether after the atonement, Ein Aton Lechem, then bread is not required. Moser de Toda, that's a residual of the Toda. And Vlad Toda Chova, if you have an offspring of a Toda that's an obligation, so then Lifnei Kapora Tu'unin Lechem, before the atonement, bread is required, La'achar Kapora, but after the Kapora, Ein Tu'unin Lechem, bread is not required, and that's exactly what we just said above. And the Gemara continues, Amar Shmuel says, Kol shebechatos mesa, anytime you have a situation by a carbon chatos where the halacha is that the animal is left to die, so if that's the scenario, betoda, by a carbon toda, ein te'una lechem, then there will be no requirement of having that accompanying bread. And Kol shebechatos roa, anytime you have a situation where by a carbon chatos we say that the animal is left to graze, and the idea is that the animal is left to graze in order to develop a blemish, so in those situations, betoda, te'una lechem, so by a carbon toda, there would be a requirement of that accompanying bread. And the Gemara continues, Mesiv Rav Amram. Rav Amram asks the following question. This is from a Brisa. Mahu Omer Hatoda Yakriv. What is the purpose of the pasuk saying Hatoda Yakriv? Again, the person shall offer it as a Toda. And it means as follows. Minayin lamafresh todaso v'yavda. From where do we know that if somebody, he designates an animal as a carbon toda, and the animal is lost, v'hifresh acheres tachten, he separates another one in its place. V'nimzas arishon, and then the first one is found, v'areshtei and omdos, and they're both standing in front of him. Minayin, from where do we know, she'ezu man sheyirtza yakriv, that whichever one he wants to bring, he can bring, v'lach ma'im, and he brings the bread with that one, he chooses whatever animal he wants to bring first, and he brings that. Talmud Lomar HaToda, the pasuk says HaToda Yaakov, it says the Toda is brought, and so therefore, again, that first one that he chooses is brought together with the bread. This was quoted earlier. Now, Yachol Teishniya Tuna Lechem, one might think that the second animal also requires bread. Talmud Lomar Yakri Venu, it says in the pasuk he brings it, and it means Echad V'lo Shnayim, it means one and not two. And the Gemara continues, Rav Amram continues his question, V'ilu gabei chatas ki agavna. Now, if you had a similar situation by a carbon chatas, the halacha actually is roa. The halacha actually is that it is left to graze, meaning to say, with regards to the second animal that is brought, over here we're saying there is no requirement of lechem. That's what we're saying in this brisa. Yet Shmuel said, Kol shebechatas roa, if it would be a situation where a chatas, where the animal would be left to graze, there would be a requirement of lechem. And where do we see the case of chatas ki agavna, similar situation where it's roeh? The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, and this is a Mishnah in Meseches Tmura, Hifrish Chataso V'yavda, let's say a person designates an animal as his chatas and it's lost, V'hifrish Acheres Tachte, and then he separates a second animal in its place, V'nimtzis Harishon, and the first one is found, V'areishte and Omdos, and again a similar situation, both are standing before him, Mischaper Biachas Mehen, so then he chooses one of them as a kapara, Ushniya Thomas, and the second one is left to die, Divrei Rebbe, these are the words of Rebbe. The Chachamim say, Ein Chatas Mesa, Ela Shenimtzis La'ach. We only say that a chatas is left to die if it's found after there's a kapara. And therefore we can infer from the chachamim, hakodem sheneschapru bailim, but let's say it's found before the kapara of the owners, so then roa, so then it's left to graze. So in this exact scenario, it is left to graze. And so again, according to Shmuel, who says that we follow the halachas essentially by chatas, and we say that if the chatas is roa, if it's left to graze, so then bread is required, so bread should be required in this case. But the brisa above said that bread is not required in this case. And so the Gemara continues and answers, Shmuel kerebi svirale, Shmuel actually does hold like Rebbe in this machlokas tanoim in Meseches Tmura, again machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim, Shmuel holds like Rebbe, Diamar avuda b'shas hafrasha, that again Rebbe says that if it's lost at the time of the hafrasha, the designation of the animals, mesa, it actually is left to die. It's not a situation of roa according to Shmuel, and therefore since it's a situation where it is left to die, that's why we say that the second animal does not require the bread. And Rashi explains, Kol shebechatas meis, anytime the chatas is locked in a cell and left to die, mefarish l'kamon, this is going to be explained later on, ve'ilu gave chatas, and whereas by chatas, im nimtzas lifnei kapara, if it is found, the first animal is found before the kapara is achieved, so then roeh, so then it's left to graze to develop a mum, and then it's sold, and the money is used for karbonis in the Beis HaMikdash, she'ein chatas meisa la'osa she'nimtzas la'achar she'kipru ha'bailim, the only time that the chatas is locked in a cell and left to die, that's only if it's found after the bailim have achieved kapara. Hanimtzis kodem shechipru habailim, but let's say it's found before the owner achieved kapara, so then roeh, so then it's left to graze in order to develop a blemish. V'ilu toda b'chi hagavna, now whereas a carbon toda in the exact same scenario, tehifrish toda v'yavda v'hifrish acheres tachteh, if he separates, he designates a toda, it's lost, and he designates another one, v'areishte and omdos, and again they're both standing in front of him. So shnia ein te'una lechem, there we say that the second one does not require bread. As it's written, Yakri venu la'echad v'lo shtayim, it says you bring it, that's one and not two. But vehechi kamer kol shebechatas roa betoda tu'una lechem, so therefore how does the rule work? What Shmuel said, that anytime the chatas is left to graze, so then bread is required, it's not true. Over here it's a situation where it is left to graze, and we say that bread is not required. And the Gemara continues and answers, Shmuel ki Rebbe svirale, Shmuel actually holds like Rebbe, Diamar avuda b'shas afrash, who says that if it's lost at the time of designation, the shniya mesa, Shmuel actually holds like Rebbe that the second one, it is not left to graze, it is left to die. Afilu nimtzis kodem sheneschapra abailim, and that's true even if it's found before the kapar is achieved. And lahachi l'shmuel ein tunin lechem, therefore it's consistent. That's why according to Shmuel, there is no requirement of bread. And the Gemara continues and asks, Ela roa l'Rebbe hechim ashkachas la, but a situation of roa where the animal, the chatas, is left to graze, where do we find a scenario like that? And the Gemara answers, Kid Reb Oshia, it's like Reb Oshia said, D'yamar Reb Oshia, because Reb Oshia said, Hifrish shtei chatos la'achrayas, let's say a person designates two chatas animals, and it's meant to be a guarantee, meaning if one becomes lost, so then he's going to use the other, so mischaper be'ezeh me'en sheyirtza, so then he can choose whichever one he wants for the kapara, v'hashniyatir, and the second one is left to graze. That would be the scenario of roa according to Rebbe. But the Gemara continues, well, if that is the scenario of roa according to Rebbe, so then in the same situation by a carbon toda, we should say that there's no accompanying bread. But the Gemara continues and asks, if that is the scenario of roa according to Rebbe, so then in the same scenario by carbon toda, there should be a requirement of bread. But v'hagabe toda ki agavna, but by toda in the same scenario, ein tuna lechem, there actually is no requirement of bread in the exact same scenario. Let's say the person designates two animals, and the idea is he's designating lachrayas. Again, only one of them requires the bread, and not the second one. And so therefore, the Gemara continues, Ella rather, Shmuel Rebbe Shimon Svirale. Shmuel actually holds not like Rebbe, not like the Rabbanan, he holds like Rebbe Shimon. De Amar Chamesh Chatos Mesos. Shmuel says there are 5 examples of chatos where the animal is left to die. And Rashi explains, Ella roa l'Rebbe hechim ashkachas lo. What is the case according to Rebbe of roa? De kamar Shmuel kol shebechatos roa betoda tuna lechem. Because again, Shmuel said, anytime the chatos is left to graze, so then by the toda there is a requirement of bread. And so then we gave that scenario. That's when the person designates 2 of them lachrayas. But the problem is, v'agabe toda ki agavna, by toda in the exact same scenario, shem hivrish te todos lachrayas. If somebody separates 2 todos lachrayas, shem tova ra'achas te shnia tachteh, that if the first one is lost, the second one is used instead. Ein tu'una lechem. That would also be a case where no bread is required. Tichsiv, because it's written yakri venu. It says bring it le'echad v'lo l'shnayim. That's 1 and not 2. V'hechi kamer kol shebechatas roa betoda tuna lechem. So how does Shmuel say that anytime the chatas is left to graze by a toda, we would say that bread is required? And so the Gemara instead answered, Ela Shmuel lo savar lo karebi v'lo karabbanan. Rather, Shmuel, he does not hold like Rebbe or the Rabbanan. Ela Rebbe Shimon damar chamesh chatos mesos. Rather, he holds like Rebbe Shimon. Rebbe Shimon says there are 5 examples of chatos that die, and they are as follows: Vlad chatos, the offspring of a chatos; Utmuras chatos, and the attempted substitute of a chatos; V'chatos shemesu ba'aleh, let's say a chatos where the original owner died; V'shenis chapru ba'aleh ba'acher, or let's say the owner had a kapar with another animal; V'she'ivra shenasor, if the year passed, the les le hashniya ro, he does not hold that the second one is left to graze; U'dechevasa gabe toda ein tuna lechem, and in the similar cases by carbon toda, we are going to say that there is no requirement of bread. Shem hifrish beis todos lachrayas v'chulu. If the person separated 2 todos lachrayas, again for a guarantee, dahainu shekipru ba'aleh, that's a case of kipru ba'aleh. That's a case where they've already gotten atonement. Demeisa hi bechatos lachi gabe toda ein tunim lechem. And therefore, in that case, since it's a situation by chatos where the animal would be left to die, so then we would say by toda there's no requirement of bread. But the Gemara continues and asks on this, v'haroa l'Rebbe Shimon les leklal. According to Rebbe Shimon, there's no case of roa by a carbon chatos, and Rashi explains, Uparach, the Gemara asks, V'hechi amrit to Shmuel ke Rebbe Shimon sirle. How can you say that Shmuel holds like Rebbe Shimon? Rebbe Shimon les le roa klal. Rebbe Shimon doesn't even have a case of roa. Ushmuel is le damar kol shebechatos roa, but Shmuel had that as part of his rule. He said anytime we say bechatos roa, anytime by a chatos we say that it's left to graze, we say that lechem is required. And the Gemara continues and answers, Shmuel nami chadaka amar. Shmuel also, he was saying just one rule, he wasn't saying 2 rules. Kol shebechatos mesa betoda ein tuna lechem. He was saying anytime by the chatos that it's left to die, so no bread is required. And the Gemara continues, my kamashmal, and according to that, what is he teaching us? What is Shmuel actually teaching us? And the Gemara says, la'afukim mid Rabbi Yochanan, it's coming to exclude the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan de Amar, who says, Adam eschaper bishvach hektish. Again, Rabbi Yochanan says that a person is able to achieve atonement through a benefit that accrued to hektish. That would be, for example, as we said above, let's say you have the offspring of a carbon toda, and Kamash Malondalo, Shmuel is coming to teach us that that is not the case. And Rashi explains, my Kamashmal and Shmuel, what is Shmuel teaching us? Leima halacha Rebbe Shimon. He should simply say that the halacha is like Rebbe Shimon, then in all these scenarios the chatas is left to die, and in all of these scenarios we would say that the bread is not required. And Rashi continues, La'afukim mid Rabbi Yochanan, Shmuel is coming to exclude Rabbi Yochanan, Diamar Adam eschaper b'shvach hektish bevlad. Again, Rabbi Yochanan said a person is able to achieve his kapara with the shvach hektish, which we said above is referring to the offspring. And Kamashmal on Shmuel is teaching the halacha Rabbi Shimon, that the halach is like Rabbi Shimon, dehei chatos mesos, that there are 5 chatos that are left to die, and one of them is vlad chatos, one of them is the offspring of the chatos, ve'ein mischaper bo, one is not allowed to use that offspring in order to achieve atonement, uvetoda ein tu'una lechem, and by toda there would be no requirement of bread, essentially not like Rabbi Yochanan, one is not able to achieve the atonement with the vlad. And we will note over here that the Gemara is now saying that Shmuel disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan above, that was above on the Yamud Avlad Toda Chova, the Gemara said by the offspring of a Toda of obligation, that's a Toda in a situation of Harei Olai. So it said Lifnei Kapara Ton Lechem. It said that if the atonement has not yet been achieved, so then one can bring the Vlad and bread is required. And the Gemara over there quoted Rabbi Yochanan, and Shmuel would say that is not the case. Shmuel would say one is not allowed to use the Vlad to achieve that Kapara, to fulfill that obligation, and therefore bread would not be required with that Vlad. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Abba says, Zu Toda v'zu lachma. Let's say a person says this is going to be designated as the Toda, and this is its bread. So Avad halechem, if the bread is lost, Mevi lechem acher, then he brings other bread of the Toda, but if the Toda is lost, Eino Mevi Toda acheres, then he doesn't bring another Toda. My time, what's the reason? Lechem liglal Toda. The reason is that the bread is essentially ancillary to the carbon Toda. Vein Toda liglal lechem, but that's not true by the Toda. The Toda is not ancillary to the bread. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Hifrish mos l'Toda, so if one designated money for the purchase of his carbon Toda, and Rashi explains, Zu Toda v'zu lachma, this is the carbon Toda, and this is its bread, and Rashi notes, Afagav delo Amar Ola, even though he didn't say it's upon me, normally in order to be obligated to guarantee it, one needs to say it's upon me, then if it gets lost, it needs to be replaced. But here, even though he didn't say Olai, but im avad halechem, if the bread is lost, maybe lechem acher, he still does need to bring other bread. Dekevon de Amar zu nischai balachma, since he said this one is obligated with its bread, v'chozman she'ikr hazevach kayim, so as long as the animal is around, chayiv balachma, he is obligated to bring bread. My time, and what's the reason? Lechem liglal toda. Again, there's a distinction over here. If the bread is lost, he has to bring other bread. If the toda is lost, he doesn't bring another toda. And the reason is lechem liglal toda. The idea is that the lechem is ancillary to the toda. It's essentially secondary. Dechsiv v'hikriv al zevach hatoda chalos. It says the zevach, that is primary, and then the bread comes along with that. V'ein toda liglal lechem, but the toda is not liglal lechem. That's not ancillary to the lechem. Misham hachi of the toda. That's why if the toda is lost, ein maybe toda acheres. It doesn't need to bring another toda. Afagav the lach makayim, even though the bread is still around. Again, ein maybe toda acheres. He doesn't bring another toda. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Amid Beis.